The fluorescent lights of the courthouse hallway hummed with a monotonous drone that seemed to mirror the chaos inside Sarah's mind. She sat rigidly on the uncomfortable wooden bench, her small frame barely making an impression on the hard surface. 9 years old but feeling ancient. Her legs swung slightly, not quite touching the floor, a nervous habit her mother had gently asked her to stop. But today, Sarah couldn't seem to control anything about herself. Not her trembling fingers, not her racing heartbeat, not the way her stomach felt like it was performing acrobatic flips. Beside her lay Max, her golden retriever service dog, his golden coat catching the harsh fluorescent light like spun honey. Max was more than a pet. He was her anchor, her confidant, her only reliable constant in a world that had become increasingly unstable. He'd been trained specifically to recognize anxiety in Sarah and provide comfort through his presence and trained responses. But beyond his official duties, Max seemed to understand Sarah's heart in ways that adults never could. Right now, his head rested gently on Sarah's lap, and she ran her trembling fingers through his soft fur, drawing comfort from each stroke. Sarah's mother, Jennifer, sat beside her, checking her phone compulsively, a lawyer's habit. Jennifer had been a corporate attorney before the divorce consumed her life, forcing her to redirect her formidable legal skills toward protecting her daughter. She wore a navy blazer and professional makeup, but Sarah could see the exhaustion etched in the lines around her eyes, lines that hadn't been there before the divorce. Jennifer's jaw was clenched so tightly that Sarah worried her mother might crack a tooth. Every few seconds, Jennifer would glance at Sarah with an expression caught between reassurance and anxiety, as if she was trying to communicate something important without speaking. Down the hallway near the water fountain, Sarah's father stood with his attorney. Michael cut an impressive figure, tall, with carefully groomed dark hair streaked attractively with gray, and an expensive suit that probably cost more than Sarah's monthly allowance. He was handsome in that effortless way that had first attracted Jennifer years ago, but Sarah had learned that handsomeness could be deceiving. Her father was laughing with his attorney, gesturing animatedly, his charm on full display. He hadn't noticed Sarah watching him, or if he had, he didn't acknowledge her. That small rejection, barely noticeable to anyone else, cut Sarah deeper than a knife. The courthouse had become Sarah's second home over the past 6 months. She knew its layout by heart now, the marble floors that echoed footsteps, the old wooden benches that had probably witnessed countless family dramas, the portraits of stern-faced judges lining the walls like disapproving ancestors. She could navigate it with her eyes closed, but no amount of familiarity made it less terrifying. This place represented the complete fracturing of everything Sarah had believed to be permanent. A year ago, her parents were still together, still pretending to be happy, or maybe they actually were happy and Sarah just hadn't realized the signs of their disintegration. Now, she couldn't quite remember what it felt like when her father had been a consistent presence in her life. When had he started changing? When had his promises become hollow echoes? Sarah tried to pinpoint the exact moment everything started falling apart, but there wasn't a single moment. It was more like watching a photograph fade gradually in sunlight, the image becoming less and less clear until you could barely recognize it anymore. The custody modification hearing today was the third time they'd stood before a judge. The first hearing had been chaotic and emotional, with both her parents presenting their cases to a stern-faced judge who seemed more interested in the legal technicalities than in Sarah's actual. Her mother had requested a modification after Michael's behavior had become increasingly erratic and concerning. Sarah's father had painted himself as the victim of an overprotective mother trying to alienate him from his daughter. Round 1 had ended in a temporary arrangement. Michael got Friday nights and every other weekend, with supervised visits if certain conditions weren't met. But something had shifted recently. There had been an incident 3 weeks ago that her mother hadn't fully explained, but Sarah had overheard fragments of conversation through her bedroom door. Something about Michael arriving late to pick her up, reeking of alcohol, his words slurred. Something about him becoming angry and defensive when questioned. something that had prompted her mother to immediately call her lawyer and file additional documentation with the court. Today felt different, more serious, more final. Sarah's anxiety had been building for weeks. She developed a nervous rash on her arms that itched constantly. She'd stopped sleeping properly, waking up at 3 in the morning with her heart pounding. Her schoolwork had suffered. Her usually perfect grades had slipped to B's and C's as she struggled to concentrate on anything except the consuming worry about today. Max had been working overtime, sensing her distress and providing comfort multiple times throughout each day. Her mother had tried to prepare her for today's testimony. "You just need to tell the judge the truth about how you feel," her mother had said gently, though Sarah could hear the careful calculation in her words. Her mother wanted a specific truth, the truth that would support her case, her narrative, her version of events. Sarah understood that, even if she couldn't articulate it perfectly, everyone wanted her to choose a side, to declare one parent the good one and one parent the bad one. But Sarah's reality was more complicated and messier. Her father could be wonderful, attentive, funny, full of big dreams and exciting plans, and he could also be disappointing, unpredictable, and frightening. Both things were true simultaneously. Max suddenly lifted his head and looked directly at Sarah, his brown eyes containing a depth of understanding that made her chest tighten. Dogs could sense emotional shifts in humans. Max knew something significant was about to happen. He pressed closer to her, his warmth seeping through her clothes, grounding her to this moment, to this bench, to this courthouse hallway where her future was about to be decided by a stranger in a black robe. The hallway clock showed 9:47 a.m. The hearing would begin in 13 minutes. Sarah had rehearsed potential testimony in her mind 100 times, trying on different versions of the truth like outfits, trying to find one that would satisfy everyone without destroying anyone. But she knew that was impossible. Someone was going to get hurt no matter what she said. The only question was who and how badly. Jennifer reached over and squeezed Sarah's hand, and Sarah squeezed back, trying to communicate through that small gesture that she was terrified, that she didn't know how to do this, that she didn't want to be here. Her mother's squeeze tightened slightly, a message meant to be reassurance, but that felt more like pressure. Max shifted position, draping one paw across Sarah's lap, his signal that he was present and ready. Sarah took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her service dog against her, feeling the weight of her mother's expectations beside her, feeling the weight of her father's hopes burning from across the hallway. She closed her eyes for just a moment and whispered, "Help me be brave, Max." The dog's tail thumped once against the bench, a response, a promise, a plea for patience. The courthouse doors stood ahead like the entrance to another world. Beyond those doors lay the judge's chambers, the witness stand, and the moment that would reshape Sarah's entire life. The courtroom doors swung open with a soft pneumatic hiss, and everyone rose as Judge Carmichael entered. She was a woman in her late 60s with steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, reading glasses perched on her nose, and an expression that suggested she'd seen every possible human deception played out before her. Judge Carmichael had been a family court judge for 32 years, and her reputation preceded her. She was fair but firm, suspicious of theatrical displays, and deeply committed to the best interests of the child. Or at least, that's what Sarah's mother had said while reviewing her credentials. The judge took her seat at the elevated bench and began reviewing her notes without looking up at the assembled parties. The courtroom was smaller than Sarah had expected, almost intimate in its dimensions. The wood paneling made it feel like being inside someone's office rather than a palace of justice. There were maybe 25 people present, court clerks, lawyers, social workers, and in the back row, Sarah and her mother. Sarah's father sat at one table with his attorney, Richard, a slick man in an even slicker suit who had a reputation for winning custody cases through whatever means necessary. "This court is in session regarding the custody modification petition filed by Jennifer Mitchell against Michael Mitchell," Judge Carmichael announced, her voice crisp and authoritative. "Before we begin, I want to remind all parties that this proceeding is first and foremost about the child. The court's only concern is Sarah Mitchell's safety, security, and emotional health. Everything else is secondary. Is that understood?" Everyone nodded. Michael nodded too, but there was something performative about the gesture, as if he was demonstrating agreement for the judge's benefit rather than actually understanding or embracing the sentiment. "We will begin with the respondent's case," Judge Carmichael continued, glancing at Michael. "Mr. Mitchell, please take the stand." This was it. Sarah felt Max tense beside her, his trained instincts picking up on the shift in energy. Michael stood, buttoned his suit jacket, a calculated move that made him look more polished, more trustworthy, and walked to the witness stand with the confidence of a man who believed himself to be the hero of his own narrative. He was sworn in, his hand placed on the Bible, his other hand raised. "I do solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help me God," Michael repeated, and Sarah marveled at how convincing he sounded. At how many times she'd heard her father swear things were true when she knew with absolute certainty that they weren't. Richard began his questioning, his tone gentle and sympathetic. "Mr. Mitchell, can you tell the court about your relationship with your daughter, Sarah?" Michael's face transformed. His eyes glistened with what looked like genuine emotion. He swallowed hard as if gathering himself. "Your Honor, she's everything to me. She's the light of my life. Losing her would destroy me." Sarah watched from the gallery, her stomach twisting. That statement wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't exactly the truth either. Her father did love her, she was certain of that. But he loved her the way a person loves a beautiful object. They want to possess it, display it, show it off to others. There was a difference between loving someone and being committed to their. "Can you describe the nature of your involvement in Sarah's life before the separation?" prompted. Michael leaned forward slightly, making eye contact with the judge, a tactical move his lawyer had probably coached him on. "I was very involved. I helped Sarah with her homework every night. We had a special routine where we'd sit at the kitchen table and I'd walk her through her math problems. She was struggling with fractions, and I worked with her until she understood. She eventually got an A on that test." Sarah's fingers dug into Max's fur. That was half true. Yes, they'd done homework sessions, but her father had also lost his temper more than once, raising his voice when she didn't understand something immediately. She remembered specifically the night he'd slammed his hand on the table so hard that her pencil jumped. She remembered crying and him immediately softening, telling her it wasn't her fault, that he was just frustrated with himself. The homework had resumed, but the fear lingered. "Tell me about your recreational time with Sarah," continued. "We went camping," Michael said, a smile spreading across his face. "Just the two of us bonding in nature. We'd go to State Park and we'd hike and we'd sit by the fire at night talking about everything. Those were the best times, just a father and daughter making memories." The judge was scribbling notes. Sarah could see the sympathy in her expression. The camping trips, yes, they'd happened. But Michael had spent most of the first camping trip on his phone, taking work calls and responding to emails. He'd been distracted and short-tempered when Sarah had asked to go for a hike. The second trip was better, but also shorter than planned because Michael had gotten a text from someone named that had changed his mood entirely. He'd cut the trip short, citing work emergency. "How would you characterize your ex-wife's relationship with Sarah?" asked. Here, Michael's expression shifted to something that resembled concern mixed with regret. "Jennifer is a good mother, I don't want her, but I think she's overprotective. I think she's used Sarah as a weapon in our divorce. She's turned Sarah against me. And more recently, I'm worried about Jennifer's mental state. She's been erratic, calling me at all hours, making wild accusations." Sarah's mother stiffened beside Sarah. This wasn't mentioned in any of the documentation they'd reviewed. This was Michael creating a new narrative in real time, painting himself as the concerned ex-spouse worried about the mental health of his former wife, thereby casting doubt on her credibility and motivations. "Can you elaborate on these accusations?" asked. "She's claimed that I've been unreliable, late to pickups, But Your Honor, with all due respect, my work sometimes demands unexpected demands on my time. I'm a financial advisor and some of my clients have emergencies. I've always made a good faith effort to be there for Sarah. The phrase good faith effort felt like a slap to Sarah. There had been several pickups where he'd been hours late, leaving her waiting at school with the administrator, watching the parking lot for his car. There was the time he'd picked her up from her friend's house drunk. She'd heard it in his voice, seen it in the way he'd driven slightly over the center line on the way home. "Has there ever been any substance abuse on your part?" asked, a softball question designed to let Michael get ahead of any accusations. Michael shook his head firmly. "I enjoy a glass of wine with dinner occasionally like any normal adult, but I would never endanger my daughter. I'm responsible. I've never driven her anywhere if I'd had anything to drink." Another half-truth that walked the edge of outright deception. Sarah had been in his car when he'd had drinks. Not enough to be legally intoxicated, perhaps, but enough that she'd noticed his reflexes were slower, his attention divided. Enough that she'd felt unsafe. "Let me ask you directly," Mr. Mitchell said. "Do you believe you should have increased custody of Sarah?" Michael looked directly at the judge. "Your Honor, I believe Sarah needs both her parents equally. I believe that she's suffering from the current arrangement. I believe that my ex-wife has alienated me from my daughter and that more time with me would help Sarah heal. She needs her father. Every child needs their father." The judge made more notes. Sarah couldn't read the judge's expression. That was the terrifying part. You could never quite tell what a judge was thinking. Was she buying this performance? Was she seeing through it? For the next hour, Michael answered questions, each response carefully calibrated to present himself as a loving, responsible father who'd been unfairly cut off from his daughter by a vindictive ex-wife. He spoke eloquently about his dreams for Sarah, his pride in her achievements, his dedication to her future. He painted a picture of a man wronged by the system, separated from his greatest love by someone consumed by anger and revenge. By the time finished his questioning, Sarah wasn't sure if the judge would even let Michael's testimony stand as unchallenged fact, or if she'd recognize the performance for what it was, in selective truth-telling, in weaponized charm, in the art of being believed while telling a story that bore only a passing resemblance to reality. Retrier the judge looked over her glasses at Jennifer. "We will now hear from the petitioner. Ms. Mitchell, please take the stand." Jennifer stood with visible determination, smoothing down her navy blazer as she walked toward the witness stand. Unlike Michael's confident stride, Jennifer moved with the careful precision of someone acutely aware that everything she did was being observed and judged. She took the oath with a steady voice, though Sarah noticed her mother's hands trembled slightly when she placed them on the Bible. Richard remained in his seat as Jennifer's attorney, a formidable woman named, approached the stand. Was in her early 50s, with sharp features and an even sharper mind. She'd been referred to them by another attorney, someone who'd warned that they were going up against one of the most manipulative custody litigators in the state. Had accepted the case pro, telling Jennifer that what she described during their initial consultation had genuinely concerned her. "Ms. Mitchell," began, her voice warm but professional, "can you describe your current occupation and your role as Sarah's primary caregiver?" "I'm a corporate attorney," Jennifer responded, her legal background evident in her precise word choice. "I currently work part-time so that I can be present for Sarah. Before the separation, I was working full-time, but I reduced my hours specifically to ensure that Sarah had consistent, reliable care. She has anxiety, and routine and stability are crucial for her." Has Mr. Mitchell been involved in establishing Sarah's treatment plan for her anxiety? Jennifer's jaw tightened. "No. I discovered Sarah's anxiety disorder approximately 18 months ago before the separation. She was having panic attacks at school. I took her to a pediatric psychologist, got her properly diagnosed, and worked with a therapist to develop coping strategies. I also consulted with her school to ensure they understood her needs. Michael was informed, but he didn't participate in any of the treatment decisions or appointments. And has Sarah's anxiety affected her daily life? Significantly, Jennifer said. She struggles in crowded situations, she has difficulty with transitions, and she requires a consistent routine to feel safe. That's why her service dog, Max, has been such an important part of her treatment. He was recommended by her therapist as an additional layer of support. Pulled out a folder. I'm going to walk through some specific incidents that occurred during Mr. Mitchell's visitation time. Let's start with the most recent one, approximately 3 weeks ago. Can you describe what happened? Jennifer took a breath. This was clearly difficult for her. Michael was supposed to pick up Sarah at 5 o'clock on a Friday. At 6 o'clock, he still hadn't arrived. Sarah was waiting by the window, anxious because routine is important to her. At 6:30, he called, very upset, and told me he'd lost track of time because he was at a bar with colleagues. He was slurring his words. Did he sound impaired? Asked. Yes, absolutely. His words were slurred, his speech was slow, and he kept repeating himself. He picked Sarah up approximately 45 minutes late. What was Sarah's condition when he brought her back the next evening? Jennifer's voice became quieter, more controlled, the way people speak when discussing something deeply painful. She was anxious and withdrawn. I asked her about her weekend and she was reluctant to discuss it. When I pressed gently, she mentioned that her father had been angry during dinner because she'd spilled milk. She said he'd shouted at her, calling her clumsy and careless. From the gallery, Sarah felt her chest tighten. She remembered that dinner. Her father had been in a mood from the moment she'd arrived. His girlfriend, a woman named that Sarah didn't like very much, had been there, and her father had seemed more interested in impressing her than in spending time with Sarah. When the milk spilled, he'd lost his temper in a way that felt disproportionate and frightening. Ms. Mitchell continued, pulling out more documents. I have here a series of text messages that you received from Mr. Mitchell regarding scheduled pickup times. Can you walk us through these? Jennifer nodded and displayed the messages on a screen for the judge to see. There were dozens of them, texts sent just hours before scheduled pickups saying things like, can't do this weekend, something came up at work, or I have to reschedule, I'm dealing with personal stuff, or most damning, forgot about this weekend, can we do next month instead? How often would you estimate that Mr. Mitchell cancels or reschedules his scheduled visitation time? Asked. In the past 6 months, I'd say approximately 40% of the time, sometimes with more notice, sometimes with just hours to spare. Sarah has learned not to get her hopes up when a visit is scheduled because there's a very good chance it won't happen. Sarah could feel the weight of those cancellations as her mother spoke about them. Each one had felt like a small rejection, a confirmation that she wasn't important enough to be a priority. She'd started practicing emotional self-protection, telling herself that she didn't really want to go anyway, but that was a lie she told herself to avoid the disappointment. Let's discuss the medication incident from 2 months ago, said, moving to another document. Jennifer's expression became almost pained. Michael picked Sarah up for an overnight visit. Sarah needs to take an anti-anxiety medication that's prescribed by her pediatric psychiatrist. I gave Michael very explicit instructions about the medication, when to give it to her, how much, what side effects to watch for. I even put the medication in a clearly labeled container with detailed written instructions. Did he administer the medication? No, he forgot entirely. The next morning, Sarah had a panic attack so severe that she couldn't breathe properly. Michael called me, panicked, and I had to give him instructions on how to help her through it. When I asked why he hadn't given her the medication, he said he'd forgotten it was even there. He blamed me for not reminding him. The judge was writing furiously now. Sarah could see the shift in her expression. The tolerance she'd shown during Michael's testimony was being replaced by something more skeptical, more concerned. Ms. Mitchell, I want to ask you about some of the things Mr. Mitchell to this morning said. He mentioned regular homework sessions where he helped Sarah with her studies. Can you address that? Jennifer nodded. Those sessions did happen occasionally, but they were inconsistent and often ended badly. I have emails from Sarah's school expressing concerns about her anxiety increasing after certain homework sessions with her father. I also have Sarah's therapy notes, where she mentioned feeling very stressed during these sessions because her father would lose patience with her if she didn't understand something immediately. And the camping trips he mentioned. We did go camping, but I need to be honest. I was often excluded from these trips even though I suggested we make it a family activity. When they did happen, they were sometimes cut short. More concerning is that during the most recent camping trip, Michael was heavily intoxicated on the final night. Sarah came home visibly upset and told me that her father had been drinking significantly and had become angry and loud. Pulled out more documents, emails, text messages, notes from Sarah's therapist, records from the school counselor. Each piece of evidence systematically dismantled the narrative that Michael had constructed during his testimony. It wasn't that Michael was a villain. That was important to Jennifer's testimony. She consistently acknowledged his good qualities, his love for Sarah, his capability as a father when he was functioning well. But, Jennifer said, her voice firm, love isn't enough. Sarah needs reliability. She needs consistency. She needs a parent who prioritizes her over other things in their life. And right now, Michael isn't able to provide that. His behavior is becoming increasingly erratic. I'm not trying to alienate him from Sarah. I'm trying to protect her. Has Mr. Mitchell completed any of the court-ordered treatment recommendations from the previous hearing? Asked. No, he was supposed to complete an anger management course and a parenting class. He's done neither. He's also been resistant to the recommendation that he participate in family therapy with Sarah. By the time finished her questioning, the courtroom felt different. The sympathetic tolerance that had filled the air during Michael's testimony had been replaced by something heavier, more serious. The judge had stopped nodding along and had instead adopted an expression of deep concentration, as if she was mentally recalibrating everything she'd heard. Michael's attorney, Richard, attempted cross-examination, but his questions felt defensive rather than challenging. He was trying to damage Jennifer's credibility, but her testimony was supported by documentation, emails, school records, and therapist notes. With each of his questions, Jennifer calmly provided more evidence. As Jennifer stepped down from the witness stand, she caught Sarah's eye for just a moment, and there was something in that glance that communicated both apology and determination. She was fighting for her daughter, even though it meant publicly detailing the failings of a man she'd once loved enough to marry. The judge called for a brief recess, and in that quiet moment, Sarah understood that the trajectory of the hearing had shifted. The performance had been exposed. The real story was beginning to emerge. The recess felt both too short and too long. Sarah had spent it in a small consultation room with her mother and a court-appointed guardian ad, a woman named Dr. Foster, who was supposed to represent Sarah's interests. Dr. Foster was kind enough, with gentle eyes and an understanding tone, but her presence only amplified Sarah's anxiety. The fact that she needed a guardian ad meant the situation was serious in a way that made Sarah's chest feel tight. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" Dr. Foster asked, sitting at eye level with Sarah. Sarah shrugged. How was she supposed to answer that? She felt terrified, confused, guilty, angry, and sad all at the same time. She felt like she was betraying her father by being here. She felt like she was betraying her mother by not wanting to be here. She felt trapped between two people she loved, forced to choose, forced to be the deciding factor in a battle that wasn't really about her at all. It was about two adults and their inability to make peace with each other. "It's okay to be nervous," Dr. Foster continued. "But I want you to know that the most important thing today is for you to tell the truth, just the truth, not what you think anyone wants to hear, not what you think will make people happy, just what's real for you. Can you do that?" Sarah nodded mechanically, but inside she was screaming. The truth was complicated. The truth didn't fit into neat categories. The truth was that she loved her father and she was afraid of him. The truth was that she wanted both her parents but not in the same room. The truth was that she wanted to be a normal 9-year-old instead of the deciding vote in a custody case. "Sarah," the judge's voice called from the courtroom, "we're ready for you to testify." Sarah stood on legs that felt like they were made of gelatin. Her mother squeezed her shoulder supportively, but Sarah could feel the pressure beneath it, the hope that Sarah would say the right things, the things that would support her case. Sarah shuffled toward the courtroom doors, and Max started to follow. "The service dog will remain with counsel," the bailiff said, though not unkindly. Sarah felt a flash of panic at being separated from Max, but Dr. Foster leaned down and whispered, "Max will be right there where you can see him. He won't leave the courtroom." The courtroom seemed to expand as Sarah entered it, the ceiling suddenly too high, the room suddenly too large. Everyone was watching her, the judge, the lawyers, the court clerks, her mother, her father. She kept her eyes down as she walked to the witness stand, unable to meet her father's gaze. The bailiff administered the oath, and Sarah's voice sounded very small as she repeated the words about telling the truth. She was seated in the witness stand, which felt more like a chair on a stage than a place where actual testimony happened. The judge looked down at her with an expression that Sarah couldn't quite read. "Hello, Sarah," Judge Carmichael said, her voice deliberately gentle. "I know this is a difficult situation, and I appreciate your willingness to be here today. Do you understand that you've sworn to tell the truth?" "Yes," Sarah whispered, then more clearly, "Yes, Your Honor." "Good. I'm going to ask you some questions, and I want you to answer as honestly as you can. There are no wrong answers. I just want to understand your perspective. Is that okay?" Sarah nodded. Her mother's attorney began the questioning. "Sarah, can you tell me about your relationship with your dad?" This was the first real test, and Sarah froze. How could she possibly answer that in a way that was both true and wouldn't destroy anyone? She glanced toward her father involuntarily, and she could see his face, hopeful, anxious, watching her intently. Sarah began, her voice uncertain. "I love my dad. He can be really fun. We do things together sometimes." "What kinds of things?" asked gently. "We went camping. We did homework together. He takes me to get ice cream sometimes." "How do you feel when you're with your dad?" This was the dangerous question. Sarah could feel the weight of it. She chose her words carefully, each one like a brick in a wall she was building to protect everyone. It's nice, but sometimes," she trailed off. "It's okay to finish your thought," encouraged. "Sometimes he's not the same," Sarah said quietly. "Sometimes he's happy and fun, and sometimes he's different." "Different how?" Sarah's stomach twisted. She could feel her father's tension from across the room. She could feel her mother's hope. She was supposed to describe something that would hurt her father, that would prove he was unfit, that would validate her mother's case. But she didn't want to hurt him. Even after everything, after the canceled visits and the forgotten medication and the scary moments, she didn't want to stand in this courtroom and publicly condemn her own father. "He gets frustrated sometimes," Sarah said carefully. "He raises his voice. He's not patient." "Has he ever frightened you?" asked. Sarah's hands clenched into fists. "I don't want to answer that," she said, her voice becoming smaller. The judge leaned forward. "Sarah, do you understand that it's important for me to hear about your experiences? I need to understand how you feel in order to make the best decision for you." But that was the thing. There was no best decision. The best decision would be for her parents to stay together, for her to have a normal life, for none of this to be happening. The best decision would be for her father to be reliable and sober and patient all the time. The best decision would be for her to not be sitting in this witness stand feeling like she was drowning. "Yes," Sarah said finally, answering the question she'd been avoiding. "Sometimes he frightens me." She heard her father take a sharp breath, heard him shift in his seat. She couldn't look at him. "Can you give me an example?" Pressed but gently. "One time he yelled really loud at me about homework," Sarah said, her words coming in a rush now that she'd opened the floodgates. "He slammed his hand on the table and I thought he was going to hit me. He didn't, but I was really scared." The courtroom was silent. Sarah's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. "And the medication incident?" asked. "Your mother mentioned that your father forgot to give you your anxiety medication during a recent visit." "He said he forgot," Sarah confirmed. "And I had a really bad panic attack and my dad didn't know what to do and he called my mom to help me." Richard stood for his cross-examination, and his approach was markedly different from his treatment of Jennifer. He was gentler with Sarah, his tone almost paternal, which somehow made it worse. He was trying to get Sarah to recant or soften her statements by appealing to her love for her father. "Sarah, do you love your dad?" he asked. "Yes," she said immediately. "And you want to see him, don't you?" "Yes," she said, but less certainly. "Isn't it true that your mother has been telling you negative things about your dad, trying to turn you against him?" Sarah's eyes widened. This wasn't true, or at least not in the way he was implying. "No," she said firmly. My mom she just wants me to be safe." "But you're saying your dad scares you, that he's been irresponsible. Isn't that what your mother told you to say?" "No," Sarah said, her voice shaking with emotion now. "That's what I know. Those are things that actually happened." By the time Sarah stepped down from the witness stand, she felt hollowed out, as if she'd left some essential part of herself behind on that chair. She'd told the truth, but the truth felt like a betrayal. She described her father's worst moments without context, without the love that also existed, without acknowledging how complicated everything was. Max was at her side immediately, pressing against her legs, his instincts recognizing that she needed grounding and comfort. She buried her face in his fur, and for the first time that day, she allowed herself to cry, quiet, shaking sobs that came from the deepest part of her, from the place where she was still just a 9-year-old girl who wanted her family to be whole and couldn't understand why that was impossible. The judge called for a lunch recess, and Sarah was quickly escorted out of the courtroom by Dr. Foster. Her mother was involved in a strategy session with her attorneys, discussing how the testimony had gone and what the next steps would be. Her father had left through a different exit, accompanied by his lawyer, and Sarah was grateful not to have to face him. She didn't know what she'd see in his eyes: anger, disappointment, hurt, and she wasn't sure she could bear any of it. Dr. Foster had offered to take Sarah to the courthouse cafeteria, but Sarah had declined. Instead, she found herself in a small hallway on the second floor, a quieter section of the courthouse that seemed designed for people who needed to escape. There was a window that looked out onto the city streets below, benches positioned along the wall, and a drinking fountain that dripped slightly from a loose connection. It was the kind of forgotten space that existed in every large building, overlooked, undisturbed, perfect for hiding. Sarah sat on one of the benches and Max immediately settled beside her, his large body providing both weight and warmth. The courtroom had been chaos. The formality, the questions, the feeling of being dissected and examined by people with clipboards and law degrees. But here, in this quiet hallway, there was only Sarah and Max and the sound of the building settling around them. For several minutes, Sarah couldn't cry. She felt too numb, too wrung out, too emotionally exhausted to produce tears. She sat rigidly, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes staring at nothing. Max's head rested on her knee, and he periodically glanced up at her, his brown eyes tracking her emotional state with the precision of an instrument designed specifically for this purpose. Then slowly the dam broke. It started as a tremor in her shoulders, a shaking that Sarah couldn't control. Then came the tears, not the quiet, dignified tears that might have been appropriate in a courtroom, but great heaving sobs that came from deep within her chest. Her entire body convulsed with the force of her crying. She'd been holding everything in for so long, the fear, the confusion, the guilt, the anger, and now it all came pouring out like water through a broken levee. "I'm sorry," she whispered to no one in particular, or perhaps to everyone, to her mother, to her father, to the judge, to herself. "I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry." Max responded immediately. He shifted his position so that he was pressed more firmly against her, his body a solid anchor in the storm of her emotion. He placed his paw on her lap, the trained gesture that meant, "I'm here, you're not alone." His presence was so steady, so unchanging, so completely unconditional in a way that nothing else in her life was right now. Sarah ran her fingers through Max's golden fur, her hands shaking. "You're the only one who doesn't want anything from me," she whispered to the dog. "Everyone else wants me to choose, wants me to prove something, wants me to say the right thing. But you just want me to be okay." Max licked her face, his tongue rough and warm, and Sarah couldn't help but laugh through her tears, a sound that was half sob, half hysteria. She leaned her forehead against his head, and they sat like that for a long moment, breathing together, existing together in a small pocket of peace in an otherwise chaotic world. "I told the truth," Sarah continued, speaking to Max as if he could understand every word and perhaps in his own way he could. "I said bad things about Dad. I said he scared me, and all of it's true, but he's still my dad. He still loves me. Why does the truth have to hurt people?" Max made a small whining sound, a response that communicated empathy. Sarah had read somewhere that dogs could actually recognize and respond to human emotional states at a neurological level. They could detect changes in blood chemistry, shifts in pheromones, alterations in tone of voice. Max wasn't just comforting her because he'd been trained to do so. He was responding to her genuine distress because his entire nervous system was attuned to her. "I think I messed everything up," Sarah said, her voice barely audible. "I think Dad is going to hate me now. I think he's going to think I betrayed him. And maybe I did. Mom wanted me to tell the truth about the bad stuff, but she didn't tell me to exaggerate or lie. She just wanted me to be honest, but being honest feels like betrayal." She pulled back and looked into Max's eyes. "You know what the worst part is? I do feel safer with Mom most of the time. I do like my routine. I don't want to be scared when Dad picks me up, wondering if he's going to be angry or distracted or smelling like alcohol. But saying that out loud in front of a judge, in front of Dad, it felt like I was erasing all the good parts. Like I was saying Dad is a bad person when really he's just broken." A woman walked past at the end of the hallway, a courthouse employee heading somewhere with purpose. She glanced at Sarah but didn't stop, respecting the privacy of the girl and her dog in their small corner of the building. Sarah was grateful for the anonymity, for the fact that her breakdown was witnessed only by Max. "I remember when Dad was different," Sarah continued, her words flowing now like a river that had broken through a dam. "Before the divorce got bad, before everything fell apart. He used to take me to get breakfast on Saturday mornings, and he'd let me get whatever I wanted, chocolate chip pancakes, even though Mom would usually say it was too much sugar. He'd tell me jokes and make me laugh so hard that milk came out of my nose. He used to help me with my homework without getting frustrated. He actually listened when I talked about things that mattered to me." Max's tail thumped softly against the bench, as if he was validating her memory, acknowledging that yes, there had been good times, and those good times were real and valid. "But that Dad started disappearing," Sarah said, her voice becoming quieter. "And I don't know when it happened or why. It was like watching someone you love slowly turn into a stranger. And now I don't even know if the Dad I remember was the real one, or if that was just an act and the angry, distracted Dad is who he really is. And I don't know how to hold both of those truths at the same time." She wrapped her arms around Max's neck, and the dog tolerated the embrace with his characteristic patience. "Thank you for being here," she whispered into his fur. "Thank you for not judging me. Thank you for not asking me to choose or to be anyone other than who I am right now, which is just scared and confused and really, really tired." They sat together for another 15 minutes, neither moving, both existing in a state of quiet acceptance. Sarah's tears gradually subsided, though her breathing remained uneven, catching occasionally on residual sobs. Her eyes felt swollen and raw. Her throat was sore. But there was also something quieter inside her now, something that felt almost like clarity beginning to emerge from the fog. "I did tell the truth," she said finally, as if confirming it for herself. "What I said was true. Dad did scare me. He did forget my medication. He was late to pick me up. All of that happened, and maybe I'm not a bad person for saying it out loud. Maybe it's actually braver than lying, even though it doesn't feel brave. It just feels like it hurts." Max pressed his nose against her cheek, a gesture of affection that communicated more than words ever could. He understood, in the way that dogs seem to understand things without needing explanation, that Sarah was a good person doing a hard thing, and that sometimes being honest meant being willing to cause pain, not out of malice, but out of love for what was true. When Dr. Foster finally came to collect her for the afternoon session, Sarah felt marginally better, not happy, not relieved, but at least capable of moving forward. Max walked beside her, a steady presence, a reminder that she wasn't facing this alone. The afternoon session awaited, and Sarah had no idea what was coming next. But she knew that no matter what happened, Max would be there, grounding her, supporting her, loving her without conditions or expectations. The afternoon session began with closing arguments. The courtroom had filled back up with the same cast of characters: lawyers, court personnel, her parents, the judge. Sarah sat beside her mother, her hands folded in her lap, Max lying at her feet with his head resting on her shoe. The weight of his head against her foot provided a strange kind of comfort, a physical reminder that she wasn't alone in this. Richard stood first, his tailored suit crisp, his voice smooth as honey. He painted a picture of a loving father whose only crime was being human, imperfect, occasionally forgetful, but fundamentally devoted to his daughter. He spoke about the importance of paternal bonds, about how children needed both parents, about how an ex-wife's bitterness could poison a child's perception of their father. He suggested that Sarah's testimony had been influenced by her mother's coaching, that the incidents described were being exaggerated out of proportion. "Your Honor," he concluded, "what we have here is a case of parental alienation. Michael Mitchell is a good man, a dedicated father, who has been unfairly portrayed by his ex-wife as something he is not. Sarah needs her father. The court should reject this modification petition and ensure that Mr. Mitchell maintains robust visitation rights." Then stood, and her approach was methodical, almost surgical in its precision. She didn't attack Michael's character or suggest he was inherently evil. Instead, she simply laid out the facts: the canceled visits, the forgotten medication, the testimony from school personnel, the therapist's notes, the incident reports. She spoke about Sarah's anxiety disorder and the specific needs of a child with that diagnosis. She addressed the issue of substance abuse concerns without making definitive accusations, instead suggesting that at minimum, there should be requirements for intervention and treatment before custody was modified. "The petitioner isn't asking to eliminate Mr. Mitchell from Sarah's life," said, her voice measured and calm. "She's asking that visitation be structured in a way that protects Sarah's emotional and physical while allowing her father to maintain a meaningful relationship with her. That's not alienation, that's parenting. That's protecting a child." As spoke, Sarah felt something shifting inside her. She told the truth that morning, but it had been a partial truth, a truth filtered through her fear and her desire not to hurt anyone. She'd been evasive in some of her answers. She'd minimized some of her father's behavior. She'd left out details that might have been important to the judge's decision. And now, listening to the lawyers present their cases, she realized that her incomplete testimony might have the waters rather than clarified them. The judge would have to make a decision based on incomplete information, and Sarah was responsible for that incompleteness. She glanced down at Max, who was watching her intently, his brown eyes tracking her face with the precision of a trained professional. Max had been trained at an expensive facility specifically to recognize anxiety in Sarah and respond to it with calming pressure and grounding techniques. But more than that, Max seemed to understand her on a deeper level, as if there was a communication happening between them that transcended words. During her therapy sessions with her child psychologist, Sarah and Max had developed several specific signals. One signal meant, "I need grounding." Max would press firmly against Sarah's legs. Another signal meant, "I'm about to have a panic attack." Sarah would place her hand on Max's head a specific way, and Max would position himself to provide deep pressure therapy. But there was another signal, one that Doctor had developed specifically for moments when Sarah needed to access courage or clarity. A specific hand gesture, subtle enough that it wouldn't be noticed by others, where Sarah would gently press her fingers against Max's chest in a particular pattern. That signal meant, "I need to find my truth." Sarah had only used it a few times, usually during therapy sessions when she was struggling to articulate something difficult or when her anxiety was trying to convince her to stay silent about something important. The signal seemed to activate something in Max, a shift in his demeanor, a heightening of his focus, a way of being present that communicated, "I'm here, I'm with you, you're safe enough to speak." Sarah's heart was racing now. She knew what she needed to do, but not completely. She told partial truths filtered through her fear and her desire to protect her father. But the judge needed the whole picture to make the right decision. And Sarah, despite her terror and her guilt and her overwhelming confusion, wanted the judge to have that picture. She reached down slowly, her hand trembling, and made the signal against Max's chest. Press, pause, press, pause, press. The pattern was specific, practiced, deliberate. Max's ears perked up immediately. His entire body seemed to shift into a different mode of alertness. He lifted his head and made eye contact with Sarah, and in that moment there was a communication happening that was deeper than words. Max was saying, "I see you. I understand what you're about to do. I'm with you. You're not alone." Sarah's mother was focused on the judge, listening intently to his closing statement. Her father was staring straight ahead, his expression unreadable. Neither of them noticed Sarah's signal to Max. Neither of them noticed the subtle shift in Sarah's posture, the straightening of her shoulders, the deepening of her breathing. What happened next occurred almost imperceptibly. Sarah raised her hand slightly, a gesture so small it might have been missed by anyone not paying close attention, but Judge Carmichael noticed. She'd been watching the interaction between Sarah and Max throughout the entire hearing, and she was clearly attuned to the emotional dynamics in the courtroom. She noticed the signal, she noticed the shift in Sarah's demeanor, and she paused the proceedings. "One moment," Judge Carmichael said, holding up a hand to stop mid-sentence. "I notice that Sarah has her hand raised. Sarah, do you wish to address the court?" The entire courtroom seemed to freeze. Everyone turned to look at Sarah. She felt her mother's sudden tension beside her. She heard her father shift in his chair. The bailiff looked uncertain about whether this was procedurally appropriate. Richard's mouth opened in apparent objection before closing again. "Your Honor," said carefully, "Sarah has already." "I'm aware," Judge Carmichael replied, her eyes still on Sarah. "However, this child clearly has something she wishes to communicate. Given the nature of this case, I believe we should allow her to do so. Sarah, would you like to speak?" Sarah's throat felt tight. Every instinct was screaming at her to put her hand down, to pretend she hadn't raised it, to stay silent and let other people make the decisions about her life. But Max was pressed against her leg, his presence immovable and steadying, and she thought about what Doctor had said. "Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is tell our truth, even when it's scary, especially when it's scary." "I have something I forgot to say," Sarah said, her voice small but determined. This morning I didn't tell everything." "Tell everything about what?" the judge asked gently. "About my dad," Sarah said. "I was scared and I didn't want to hurt him, so I made things sound less bad than they were. But the judge needs to know the real things that happened." Judge Carmichael nodded slowly. "You may proceed, Sarah. Take your time." Sarah took a deep breath, and as she did, Max performed his trained response to her anxiety signal. He placed his paw on her lap, a weight, an anchor, a grounding technique that helped bring her back into her body. The physical contact centered her, reminded her that she was safe enough to speak her truth. "When I said my dad scared me," Sarah began, "it wasn't just the one time with homework. It's been a lot of times. When he drinks, he becomes a different person. His voice gets louder and meaner, and I never know which dad I'm going to get when he picks me up, the nice dad or the scary dad. That makes it hard for me to feel okay about going to his house." Her mother's hand reached over and squeezed hers, not pushing, just supporting. Her father's face had gone pale. "And the medication thing," Sarah continued, feeling strength growing with each word. "That wasn't the only time he forgot things. There were other visits where I asked him to remember things I needed, and he forgot. And when I have anxiety, forgetting things makes it worse because I don't feel taken care of." Sarah paused, gathering courage for the most difficult part. "I love my dad, that's still true, but I also know that being with him makes me more anxious, not less. And I'm tired of pretending that's okay. I'm tired of pretending I don't feel what I feel. I want to see my dad, but I want to feel safe when I do." The courtroom was absolutely silent. Judge Carmichael was making notes, her expression grave but thoughtful. Sarah had said the things she should have said this morning. The complete truth, not the filtered version, not the version designed to protect her father's feelings or her own fear of rejection. Max's paw remained on her lap, steady and present, a physical manifestation of unconditional support. The silence that followed Sarah's words seemed to stretch into infinity, as if time itself had paused to acknowledge the weight of her courage. Judge Carmichael set down her pen and removed her reading glasses, rubbing her eyes as if processing what she just witnessed. When she looked back at Sarah, there was something different in her expression, a recognition, perhaps, of what it had cost this 9-year-old girl to speak so honestly. Michael's attorney immediately stood, his voice sharp. "Your Honor, I object. This is improper. The child is being allowed to add testimony without proper cross-examination without—" "Sit down, mister," Judge Carmichael interrupted, her tone brooking no argument. "I'm familiar with the rules of procedure, and I'm also familiar with the principle that this court's primary concern is the best interests of the child. What we've just witnessed is a child finding her voice and speaking her truth. That voice matters in this proceeding." Sarah's mother was crying silently, tears streaming down her face, her hand still gripping Sarah's. But there was something in her expression beyond grief. There was pride and relief and validation that she'd been right to push for this hearing, right to fight for her daughter's safety. Her father's response was different. Michael sat rigid, his face flushed a deep crimson. His jaw clenched and unclenched as he processed Sarah's words. For just a moment, Sarah saw something flash across his face, anger perhaps, or deep hurt, or both. But then, as if remembering where he was, he seemed to collapse into himself, his shoulders sagging, his head tilting down. He looked smaller somehow, diminished not by anything external but by the weight of hearing his daughter's honest assessment of how his behavior had affected her. "Sarah," Judge Carmichael said, her voice gentle but carrying the weight of judicial authority, "I want to commend your courage. What you've done today, speaking your truth, even though it was difficult, even though you love your father, that takes remarkable bravery. Many adults struggle to do what you've just done. Do you understand how important what you've said is?" Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. "I also want to acknowledge something that has been very apparent throughout this proceeding," the judge continued, and now she was looking directly at Max. "The presence of this service dog has clearly been instrumental in helping you access your voice. I've observed how Max responds to your emotional state, how his presence seems to ground you and provide you with a sense of safety. I'm incorporating that observation into my decision." Richard stood again, attempting to regain some control of the narrative. "Your Honor, if I could cross-examine." "I don't think that will be necessary," Judge Carmichael interrupted. "I believe the truth has been sufficiently established. I'd like to take a brief recess to review my notes and prepare my decision. We'll reconvene in 20 minutes. The bailiff called out the standard dismissal language, and people began to shuffle and gather their materials. But Sarah sat frozen in her seat, suddenly aware of what she'd just done. She'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. She'd spoken words that couldn't be unsaid. She'd potentially damaged her relationship with her father in a way that might never fully heal. Max seemed to understand the shift in her emotional state. He moved closer, pressing his body firmly against her legs, providing the deep pressure therapy that was his specialty. Sarah leaned down and wrapped her arms around his neck, burying her face in his fur. She was shaking now, the adrenaline that had powered her courage now draining away, leaving her vulnerable and terrified. "You did the right thing," her mother whispered, pulling Sarah into an embrace. "Sarah, you were so brave, you told the truth." But Sarah felt numb. Yes, she'd told the truth. But what was the cost of that truth? She could see her father from the corner of her eye, standing with his attorney, his face still pale, his movements sluggish and defeated. He'd caught her eye for just a moment before looking away, and in that glance, Sarah had seen hurt that went deeper than anger. Dr. Foster appeared beside them. "Sarah, you need to take a break. Would you like to go to the consultation room?" Sarah nodded mutely. She let herself be led away from the courtroom, away from her father's wounded expression, away from the scene of her own honesty. Max walked beside her, never breaking contact, always present. In the small room, Sarah sat on a chair that was far too large for her, swinging her legs, her mind a jumble of conflicting emotions. Part of her felt relief. She'd finally said the things that needed to be said. The complete picture had been presented. She'd stopped pretending that everything was fine when it wasn't. But another part of her felt overwhelming guilt and sadness. She'd hurt her father. She'd stood in front of a judge and essentially said that her father was unreliable, that he scared her, that his love wasn't enough to make her feel safe. "I think I'm a bad person," she said quietly to Dr. Foster, who had sat down across from her. "Why do you think that?" Dr. Foster asked, her voice carefully neutral, her years of experience evident in her gentle approach. "Because I made my dad sad. Because I said mean things about him in front of a judge. Because I don't think he's going to want to see me anymore after what I said." Dr. Foster leaned forward slightly. "Sarah, do you think what you said was true?" "Yes," Sarah admitted, "but that doesn't make it not mean." "There's a difference between being truthful and being mean," Dr. Foster said. "You weren't mean to your father. You were honest about your experience. Those are two very different things. And being honest, even when it's difficult, is actually a sign of strength, not weakness." "But he looked so sad," Sarah whispered. "He did," Dr. Foster agreed. "And that sadness is probably about his own behavior, not about you. Your father is having to confront some difficult truths about how his actions have affected you. That's painful for him, but it's also important. Sometimes people need to understand the impact they've had on those they love in order to make changes. What you did today, your honesty, that gives your father an opportunity to understand and potentially change." Sarah wasn't sure she believed that, but she held on to the hope that Dr. Foster might be right, that somehow, some way, her truth might lead to something positive, even if it didn't feel positive right now. When they returned to the courtroom for the judge's decision, the atmosphere had shifted. There was a finality to it now, a sense that something significant was about to happen. Michael sat alone at his table, his attorney having briefly excused himself to take a phone call. Michael looked like he'd aged 10 years. His expensive suit hung on him like he'd shrunk inside it. He didn't make eye contact with Sarah or her mother. Judge Carmichael entered, her expression grave and composed. She took her seat and arranged her notes before her. "This court has carefully considered all the testimony, evidence, and observations presented in this proceeding. While I recognize that Mr. Mitchell cares deeply for his daughter, the evidence clearly demonstrates a pattern of behavior that is not in Sarah's best interest. Sarah's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst. Max pressed against her leg, grounding her in the present moment. The court finds, Judge Carmichael continued, that the current visitation arrangement is no longer appropriate. I am modifying the custody order as follows. Primary custody and decision-making authority shall remain with the mother, Jennifer Mitchell. Visitation with the father shall be modified to supervised visitation only, pending completion of the following requirements: anger management counseling, substance abuse evaluation and any recommended treatment, and parenting classes specifically focused on the needs of children with anxiety disorders. Michael's face crumpled. His attorney, who had returned to the courtroom, placed a hand on his shoulder, but Michael barely seemed to notice. Furthermore, Judge Carmichael said, this court specifically recognizes the significant role that Sarah's service dog, Max, played in enabling her to access her truth and speak honestly about her experiences. I am ordering that Sarah's mental health treatment continue to include the presence and support of Max. The therapeutic bond between this child and her animal companion is evident and valuable, and it should be supported and maintained. The judge looked directly at Sarah. Sarah, I want you to know that what you did today took real courage. You told the truth about your experience, even though you love your father, even though you knew it would have consequences. That's the kind of courage that matters. That's the kind of honesty that makes the world better. I hope you're proud of yourself. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face. Not tears of sadness, but tears of release, of having finally been seen and understood. Max's tail thumped against the bench beside her, as if the dog himself recognized that justice had been served, that a child had been protected, that truth had prevailed. But looking at her father's broken expression across the courtroom, Sarah's victory felt complicated and bittersweet. She'd won the case, but at a cost she wasn't entirely sure she could bear. The courthouse doors seemed heavier as Sarah pushed through them into the afternoon sunlight. The case was over. The decision had been rendered. She was now the child whose testimony had changed the outcome of a custody battle, whose honesty had resulted in her father's visitation rights being restricted to supervised-only arrangements. The thought should have filled her with relief, but instead, it sat in her chest like a stone. Her mother held her hand firmly as they walked down the marble courthouse steps. Jennifer's face was a mixture of vindication and exhaustion. She'd fought for this outcome, had sacrificed time and money and emotional energy to protect her daughter, and she'd won. But Sarah could see in her mother's expression that the victory wasn't as clean or satisfying as she might have hoped. "You were incredible in there," Jennifer said, stopping on the steps to crouch down to Sarah's eye level. "Do you understand what you did? You spoke your truth, and that truth protected you. That's going to help you heal." Sarah nodded mechanically, but she didn't feel healed. She felt raw and fractured and uncertain. Max walked beside her, his leash loose, his presence steady as always. The dog seemed to understand that this moment, while significant, wasn't necessarily a moment for celebration. They reached their car, and Sarah climbed into the back seat with Max, who immediately positioned himself to provide comfort. Sarah buried her face in his fur, and he remained perfectly still, allowing her to process whatever emotions needed processing. The drive home was quiet. Her mother didn't try to fill the silence with reassurance or optimism. She simply drove, allowing Sarah the space to exist with her complicated feelings. Sarah watched the city pass by the window, the familiar streets, the stores they shopped at, the parks where she and Max usually walked in the evenings. Everything looked the same as it always did, but everything felt different. She was different now. She'd crossed a threshold from which she couldn't return. When they arrived home, Sarah went directly to her room, Max following close behind. She lay on her bed, curling around her dog, and finally allowed herself to cry. Not the release of tears from earlier, but deeper, more complex tears that contained sadness, relief, guilt, and confusion all mixed together. An hour later, there was a soft knock on her door. Her mother entered, carrying 2 mugs of hot chocolate, and sat on the edge of Sarah's bed. She didn't say anything at first, just handed Sarah one of the mugs and sat with her in companionable silence. "I keep thinking about Dad's face," Sarah said finally. "He looked so hurt." "He did," Jennifer acknowledged. "And that's a hard thing to witness. But Sarah, your father's hurt isn't your responsibility. Your responsibility is to be honest about your own experience and to take care of yourself. Your father's pain is something he needs to work through with his therapist and through the work he's going to do. The anger management, the substance abuse evaluation, all of it." "Do you think he'll do it?" Sarah asked. "Do you think he'll actually go to those classes and get help?" Jennifer took a moment before answering. "I don't know. That's going to be up to him. But I do know that you've given him the opportunity. You've shown him, in a very clear way, that his behavior has consequences, that the people he loves are affected by his choices. Sometimes people need that mirror held up to them before they're willing to change." Over the following weeks, Sarah began the process of understanding what her testimony actually meant. The judge had ordered that Sarah continue working with Dr., her child's psychologist, and that Max's involvement in her therapeutic process be maintained and supported. For the first time, Sarah's mental health needs were being treated as paramount, not as secondary to parental rights or family dynamics, but as the central concern of the entire legal proceeding. Her first appointment post-hearing was particularly significant. Doctor spent most of the session asking Sarah about her experience in the courtroom, about how she was processing everything that had happened. "I feel guilty," Sarah admitted. "I know logically that I did the right thing, but I feel like I betrayed my dad." "Let's examine that guilt," Doctor suggested. "What specifically are you guilty about?" "I said bad things about him in front of a judge. I made his visitation supervised. I basically told the court that he's not a good parent." "Did you lie?" Doctor asked gently. "No," Sarah said quietly. "Everything I said was true." "So the guilt you're experiencing isn't about dishonesty. It's about the consequences of truth. That's an important distinction. You're not guilty of wrongdoing. You're experiencing the discomfort that comes from speaking difficult truths. That's actually a sign of your conscience, of your capacity for empathy. It means you care about your father, even though his behavior has been harmful to you." "Can someone be harmful and still deserve love?" Sarah asked, a question that seemed far too mature for a 9-year-old, but that came from the depths of her genuine confusion. "Absolutely," Doctor said. "In fact, that's one of the most important lessons you can learn. Love and accountability aren't mutually exclusive. You can love your father and still hold him accountable for his behavior. You can care about his and still insist that he treat you with respect and care. Those things can coexist." 3 weeks after the hearing, Sarah received a letter from her father. Her mother brought it to her with a careful expression, allowing Sarah to decide whether she wanted to read it. Sarah took the envelope with trembling hands. Her father's handwriting was familiar, the same handwriting from birthday cards and permission slips and notes left on the kitchen counter. Inside was a handwritten letter. "Dear Sarah, I know you probably don't want to hear from me right now, and I understand if you don't want to respond to this letter. But I needed to write it anyway, because there are things I need to say to you. First, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for scaring you. I'm sorry for not being reliable when you needed me to be. I'm sorry for forgetting your medication and for arriving late and for raising my voice at you. None of those things were your fault, and you didn't deserve any of that. I want you to know that what you said in court was brave and true. It wasn't a betrayal, it was honesty, and I know now that I needed to hear it. I've started going to the anger management classes the judge ordered, and I've scheduled an appointment with an addiction counselor. I'm not going to lie to you and say it's easy or that I'm all better, but I'm trying. I'm doing this for you, and I'm also doing this for me because I want to be a better father. I want to be someone you can trust. I love you, Sarah. That hasn't changed. But love isn't enough if it's not backed up by responsible behavior. I'm working on that. Your father. Sarah read the letter 3 times, each time experiencing a different emotion. By the third reading, she was crying. But this time, the tears felt cleaner somehow, like they were washing away some of the guilt and confusion she'd been carrying. Can I write him back? She asked her mother. Jennifer smiled, and there was genuine warmth in it. Of course you can. Sarah sat at the kitchen table with Max beside her and carefully composed her own letter. Dear Dad, thank you for your letter. I forgive you, but I'm still scared. I hope that's okay. I hope that the classes help you. I hope that one day I can visit you without being nervous about what mood you're going to be in. I still love you, but I also love myself and I need to take care of myself. The judge said that was okay. Maybe someday we can go camping again, and you can be the dad you were when you were good. I miss that dad. Love, Sarah. The months that followed the hearing were a process of gradual healing. Sarah's anxiety didn't disappear overnight, but it became more manageable. She continued her therapy sessions with Doctor, and Max remained her constant companion throughout. The bond between Sarah and her service dog had become even stronger after the hearing. Max seemed to understand that he'd played a crucial role in Sarah finding her voice, and he carried that responsibility with quiet dignity. 3 months after the hearing, Sarah attended her first supervised visitation with her father. It took place in a neutral counseling office, with a trained supervisor present. Michael arrived looking both hopeful and terrified. He was in a support group now for anger management, and he'd completed a substance abuse evaluation that had revealed patterns of problematic drinking. He was enrolled in a treatment program. When he saw Sarah, his eyes filled with tears, but he didn't rush to hug her or overwhelm her. Instead, he sat down at the small table where Sarah was waiting with Max, and he simply said, "Hi, sweetheart. I'm really glad to see you." "Hi, Dad," Sarah said quietly, and something in her chest loosened just slightly. They didn't have a perfect visit. There was awkwardness and uncertainty on both sides, but there was also genuine effort. Michael asked Sarah about school, and he actually listened to her answers without getting distracted. He asked about Max and her therapy. He didn't make excuses for his past behavior, and he didn't ask her to pretend that the hard things hadn't happened. "I'm proud of you," Michael said near the end of the visit, "for telling the truth. I know that was hard." "Thank you for trying to get better," Sarah replied, and she meant it. As Sarah left the visitation with her mother and Max, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: cautious hope. The path forward wouldn't be easy, and there were no guarantees about what kind of relationship she and her father would eventually build. But there was possibility now. There was the chance that truth and accountability and genuine effort might actually lead somewhere healing. Max walked beside her, his golden coat catching the late afternoon sunlight, his presence steady and unwavering. Judge Carmichael had been right. This dog had given Sarah the courage to speak her truth. But more than that, Max had shown Sarah what unconditional love actually looked like. Present, non-judgmental, supportive regardless of circumstances. Sarah reached down and stroked Max's head, and in that moment she understood something profound. She had been brave. She had spoken her truth. She had protected herself. And in doing so, she'd also created the possibility for her father to become better. That wasn't betrayal. That was love in its truest, most difficult form. The journey toward healing had begun, and Sarah, with Max by her side, was ready to walk it, one careful step at a time. The end.